Richard Wilding is Professor of Supply Chain Management at the Centre of Logistics and Supply Chain Management, Cranfield School of Management. His presentation, Supply Chain Risk Reduction Through Effective Collaboration, looks at the sources of risk and how to manage them. Richard, thanks for joining us today.
No problem, it's a pleasure.
So, how would you classify an effective supply chain?
Well, really, effective supply chain, if you think about what we're trying to do with supply chain management, it's all about management of relationships, and I think people often forget that. And why do we want to manage relationships? Well, it's to enhance value for the final customer, but also to lower costs across the supply chain as a whole. That's really what we're trying to achieve with effective supply chain management. We might use frameworks to do that. I mean, one framework I use is what I call the 3 T's of highly effective supply chains. I focus on time. Time's a really important dimension because time is like the x-axis in every graph we should be producing. Once we understand time, we can plot process against time, cost against time, value against time, demand against time, and so on and so forth. That then leads to transparency because people can then start seeing what's going on, which then leads to trust. When we have trust, we stop playing games like, oh, I need those goods for Friday, but I'll ask for them on Monday instead, just in case they're late. Or I need 1,000 items, but I'll ask for 1,100 instead. So once we get those 3 areas in place, then we get very effective supply chains. And the final thing is the people dimension. What we have to do is move people from what we call I-shaped people. These are people who are just sitting in their function, doing their own thing, to what we call T-shaped people. If you can imagine somebody, sitting there with their arms out, T-shaped person is somebody who understands the process they are part of, in other words, going across them in the top of the T, but also has their functional specialism within their business. I don't want everybody lying on the floor, but I need people to understand the process that they are part of, the supply chain process they're part of.
And how does effective collaboration reduce risk?
Well, really what's actually happening is when we start to collaborate, we start to understand the other party. We start to get information on what's going on in the other party. And what we've got to recognise that supply chain risk is not a single company thing. The risks, yes, you've got problems in your own business which generate risk, but it's also across the supply network. I mean, a great example of this was when Toyota, for example, they had a fire in 1997. That fire actually took out a component supplier of just a very small component, which was seen really to some degree as non-critical. But that whole facility was shut down. It actually shut down Toyota's production system within a couple of days. That then shut down the whole supply base within a few more days. And then they were in a situation of how can we actually resurrect the manufacture of these components? They had absolutely nobody there. The good thing about Toyota was, because of the way they managed their relationships, they actually got 64 other suppliers just doing a little bit on each thing, which then was able to resurrect the supply chain again. So you've got to have those relationships in place. And I think the big thing about this is you can't, when the incident happens, it's often too late to start building the relationships. You've got to start building those relationships and get collaboration going in the supply chain well before the incident happens. So we do need to actually focus on that and develop that within, well, really, it's an important part. As I said, supply chains are all about relationships. So, often as supply chain professionals, we like to focus on all the hard stuff like our inventory management, stock control and everything else, but how much time do we actually spend on managing relationships within that environment? That's something which companies need to sort of think about.
Now this isn't just something that supply chain managers can just wake up to one morning and do. So what is your advice for anyone attempting to draw up a risk management plan?
Okay, well, I mean, really the first thing is, if you're thinking about the 3 T's, transparency. When we can start to get transparency of what's going on, it makes a big difference. I often say to people, have you got your supply chain on one piece of paper that anybody can understand? A hairdresser can understand. Why a hairdresser? Because if you're trying to share information across the supply chain, you've got to make sure it's accessible to anybody within that network. Now, so transparency, how can we do that? Simple techniques like time-based process mapping. We have experience of people doing this for just a day. I mean, I was working recently with a large brewing organisation looking at one particular sort of supply chain process, and within half a day we had transparency of what was going on. We had the marketing people, the production people, even their third-party logistics provider all going, we don't believe we're doing this, these are the issues that are going on. So I think my top tip to people is if you're going to go and do just one thing tomorrow, go in there and start doing some very basic time-based process mapping. There's a whole methodology attached to this. It means walking the process and really understanding what's going on with respect to time. Measure the time dimension. Then you've got that x-axis, transparency is there, trust starts to build, and when you've got that sort of situation, you can then start to build flexibility. The relationships are there. If things start to happen, you can adapt and you can move on.
Richard, I wish we had more time, but this is a fascinating subject that goes beyond just implementing a technology. But nevertheless, it's been a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you very much indeed.